For those who saw my review on Conley War's Vengeance, I mentioned how there were two directions a dev team could take when making a sequel, and based on what I ascertained, I drew to the conclusion it was an improvement overall, despite retaining some problems from its 97 release. During its prime, Conley War's Vengeance, like its predecessor, was a hit and thus a sequel was on the cards, but what happens when a series goes in the opposite direction? Developed and published by Psygnosis, Conley War's Red Sun is the third and final entry in the series, though after investing my time into it, it doesn't look, sound and feel like it's part of the same canon. The game is set during the Vengeance storyline, but rather than fighting for the League or Colonial Navy, instead you assume the role of Valdemar, a miner turned mercenary who's been dealing with visions. He comes into contact with a mysterious man who explains the Red Sun isn't what she seems and could decide the fate of the universe. With this in mind, Valdemar teams up with a young woman named Diva so they can track down the Red Sun before it's too late. One of the defining features from previous games was the branching paths and how they can influence what missions you partake in, as well as affect the ending depending on your performance. Branching paths aren't new these days, but those in this series complemented the idea you were part of a conflict between two warring factions, even if the experience was flawed by other factors. Red Sun doesn't continue that tradition, instead going for a linear approach with its storytelling. You're given numerous missions that can be finished in any order, and they award credits for buying new ships and weapons. The problem is, your options are limited and every new ship investment made results previous owned craft obsolete. It also doesn't help that story-based missions give you too many credits, which makes the others trivial in addition of not being relevant with the narrative. As for weapons, they're unlocked while playing through the main story, and you're no longer restricted on what firepower you can bring for each skirmish. However, because the general purpose lasers you start with are so powerful, there's no incentive to utilise alternative loadouts, and some armaments have limited ammunition which costs credits, whereas the starting weapons don't have this issue and they're not prone to overheating for some reason. The only exception is when you're forced to use specific weapons for a given operation, but if you think the starting lasers were overpowered, the experience is exacerbated by how doltish enemies behave, a significant contrast with those from previous installments. In fact, it was getting to a point where I was spawn killing them before they could do significant damage. If the first two games had foes that were cheap for being too difficult, Red Sun went in the opposite direction, not to mention restarting stages is now possible through the pause menu. While this change means you don't have to reload a specific save, this doesn't alleviate combat being mundane considering you'll be using the same weapons, and combined by how easy enemies are regardless if they're fighters, ground units or capital ships, Red Sun gets humdrum prematurely. There was one ground based level however that was difficult, but for all the wrong reasons. Around 3/4 into the game, you're tasked on defending a refinery so the personnel can evacuate from fighters and ground units. Sounds simple enough, but
what's the problem?
Well, first of all, you have no support during the mission, even though the cutscene before shown our hero with their companion, and second, enemies constantly respawn as well as appearing from all directions, which means being a bastion is near impossible even with defense and repair pods. As for controlling your ship, that's done with either with the D-pad or with the left analog stick. Rolling your craft is done with the L2 and R2 buttons respectively, and accelerating is controlled by R1 while reversing is done with L1. It's also worth noting that double tapping one or the other gives you an extra speed boost for a short time. Firing primary weapons is done with X and secondary weapons are controlled by circle, both of which allow weapon switching, although it's unimportant because of the issues I've already listed. Lastly, if you're being locked on, flares can be deployed by pressing L2 and R2 with circle at the same time. From a presentation perspective, Red Sun is rough in places. Although the textures are just like those, if not similar, in Vengeance, the ship models have taken a turn for the worst, and not just those Valdemar pilots but also for his adversaries, not to mention the frame rate can be inconsistent. The score by Gary McKill is decent on its own, but there's no sense of urgency, and due to its lack of tracks it quickly becomes repetitive. The voice acting is passable, though Valdemar's dialogue is primarily exposition, otherwise he's delivering quips without hesitation, which seem out of place compared to the dark tone Vengeance had. Red Sun was going for a centralised story, but how it's delivered is ham-fisted as some plot points don't add up. Valdemar soon learns the Red Sun is a doomsday device, but how it's able to destroy all life is underdeveloped, and the fact Valdemar is dealing with parties that have no connection with this threat undermine its importance. Needless to say, why is Valdemar dealing with pirates if he's on a quest on saving the universe? Shouldn't he be cooperating with either the League or Colonial Navy for his mission? Indeed, there are levels where he could side with one or the other, but it would be more satisfying if he could gradually earn their trust for his goal. Alternatively, have these new parties allegiance with either the League or Colonial Navy, and as Valdemar cooperates with them, it would get the attention of the big boys. These not only give the protagonist a sense of agency, the League and Colonial Navy will have a much greater presence in the plot, rather than just being there as a backdrop, and the branching paths could still be relevant within the game's context. However, what we have is a linear plot with an uninteresting, reactive character who only saves the universe because someone told him to and lacks character development. Likewise, Diva isn't compelling as Valdemar's companion because she doesn't do anything other than accompany the protagonist. And then we have the Shahar, who are one-dimensional, uninspired antagonists because of their on-the-nose dialogue. I could go on, but for the sake of brevity, the narrative simply makes no sense and it leaves much to be desired. The cutscenes are okay at best, but the character animations look stiff for a 2000 release, although visual fidelity isn't always everything. Colony Wars Red Sun got critical acclaim in 2000, but playing it today felt like I was going through the motions. So you may be wondering, what made Psygnosis go in this direction? Well, they actually didn't, because the game wasn't produced by the main team, who were based in Liverpool. Instead, it was done by their Leeds team, which was the only game they made. I can understand the need for change to make progress and prevent stagnation. Capcom, for instance, did that with Resident Evil 4, going from its survival horror origins into an action-packed direction, before eventually returning to its roots with 2017's Resident Evil 7. However, it's one thing to make change with a given purpose, and then there's change for the sake of it, and Colony Wars Red Sun, for the most part, classifies with the latter. That being said, this was one of the last titles Psygnosis published before rebranding themselves as SCE Studio Liverpool, continuing with such works like WipeOut and a number of Formula 1 entries, before Codemasters took over the license and still maintain it to this day. Colony Wars Red Sun is playable, but it's not enjoyable.